In the last episode, we introduced psychoanalytic theory and Sigmund Freud, and we discussed what he might call the problem of happiness. We live in an advanced society. Generally, most of us would prefer civilization to a state of nature. And yet, despite all of those advancements that we've made as a species, it seems that a lot of us are still unhappy. And what makes the problem of happiness even more sinister is that, based on all the things we went through in the last episode, it's not exactly clear where that happiness could or should come from. At least, there's certainly not a single one-size-fits-all approach. Freud goes on to say that he believes there's only 3 types of people in the world. Type 1 is the type of person that finds happiness in emotional relationships with other people. So this is the type of person who constantly likes to be around others, bouncing ideas back and forth, getting comfort and safety from the group or the community. The second type of person for Freud finds happiness in their own inner mental processes. So this type of person may be a little bit more of a hermit style, and it might be solo hobbies or intellectual activities that give them that feeling of joy and happiness. And then the final person for Freud is the man of action, he calls it. This is the person who likes to test their strength against the world. And they get their satisfaction in life from overcoming nature or overcoming systems that are in place to put them down. But of course, the problem is that the world is undefeated. Freud thinks that the obstacle in the way of all 3 of those types of people, the obstacle in their way of happiness, is civilization itself. And I think in order to understand what Freud is talking about here, we have to back up a little bit and understand where Freud and where psychoanalytic theory thinks that civilization came from to begin with, and how someone like Freud would think civilization has developed over time. So according to Freud, civilization is, quote, all achievements and institutions that mark the distance of our lives from that of our animal ancestors, serving 2 purposes: protection from nature and the regulation of the relationships between humans, end quote. Here, Freud is saying that civilization is something that develops out of human nature, and it serves to protect us from nature and provide us an opportunity to overcome nature when necessary. And it also serves to regulate the interests of humans when oftentimes human nature might say they're going to go against each other. Now, there's also some psychoanalytic stuff here that, to be clear, if you brought this stuff up in a room of historians, you would get laughed out of the room. So Freud thinks that civilization all starts with the family. And you have your 2 partners, and for Freud, remember, there's always a sort of underlying sexual drive that's going on in the id. And Freud is saying that the family forms so that you can have a sexual partner that doesn't just show up from time to time, but is always close by and always there recurringly. There may be members of the audience who would question that premise for a variety of reasons, but I digress. But eventually, that family gradually expands into a community when you have a community of families working together, and they realize that they can all help each other with work. And there's also a power of love thing going on where it's not just all about sexual attraction, but you develop love and caring for the members of your community. And there is this sort of working together element that Freud sees in civilization, especially as it develops to its more modern phase. Now, there's some other stuff in here about how Freud views civilization developing. And I'm going to read you 2 footnotes here I don't read these for shock value. I read them because they're there. And I think this element of psychoanalysis is actually important to understanding Freud's larger points in this book, Civilization and Its Discontents. But again, this is the type of thing that sounds insane to us in the modern day and would get you laughed out of the room if you're talking about the development of civilization in a room full of historians, and this is the type of stuff you're talking about. But I'll let you be the judge. So this comes in a footnote in chapter 3 of Civilization and Its Discontents. Freud talking about the civilizational importance of humans no longer using their own urine to put out fires. Quote, "Whoever was first to renounce this pleasure and spared the fire and could then carry it away with him and force it into his service. By dampening the fire of his own sexual arousal, he had tamed the natural force of fire. This great conquest of civilization would thus be the reward for a renunciation of one's instincts. And further, it is as if the woman had been appointed to keep the fire imprisoned in the domestic hearth, because her anatomical structure prohibits her from giving in to such an attempt at pleasure. It is also noteworthy how regularly the experiences during analysis testify to the connection between ambition, fire, and the eroticism of urine." End quote. Here's another footnote in a different chapter where Freud's talking about how cleanliness as a social value developed from a civilizational perspective. He says, talking about why we don't want our streets filled with excrement, he says, quote, "The social factor responsible for the further transformation of anal eroticism is attested to by the fact that, despite all the advances in development, the smell of one's own excrement is hardly offensive to man, but only that of the excretions of others. The unclean individual, i.e. the one who does not conceal his excrement, insults the other and shows no consideration for him, which also finds its expression in the strongest, most common insults. It would also be incomprehensible that humans should use the name of their most faithful friend in the animal kingdom as a swear word if the dog did not attract man's contempt for two of his traits, that dogs are scent-oriented animals that do not shy away from excrement, and that dogs are not ashamed of their own sexual functions." End quote. This is why you read the footnotes, folks. And this is also what we mean when we say that in the modern day, in the new scientific era of psychology, this is the type of stuff that is generally frowned upon and generally scoffed at a little bit. And so obviously we take this type of stuff with a grain of salt, and we kind of look a little deeper into Freud and try to see the big questions that he's asking and the conclusions that he's coming to, which I think are interesting if you're trying to understand human behavior. So whether it's these underlying sexual impulses that drive civilization, or it's love for members of our community, ultimately we have these characteristics of civilization according to Freud. So he believes that science and technology in the modern day have essentially allowed us to become like gods. Think about Greek mythology, the gods of ancient Greece, and these people generally represented ideals. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, and so on. But these gods were larger than life figures. They were celebrities. They were the ideals that uphold civilization, and humans were trying to epitomize them in their gods. So if you think about that now, all of the things that the gods or the goddesses had, all of those ideals are now fairly easily attainable. You want a perfect body, like those statues of ancient Greece? You can do that now. You want wisdom? It's available. Riches beyond belief? Possible. Maybe even some of the things that we thought never would be possible. Things like planetary travel, infinite storehouses of information, and so on. But as we come closer to realizing these ideals and epitomizing them not in gods or goddesses, but in ourselves, amazingly, we still aren't happy, according to Freud. And before we get to why that is, we'll continue on with some of these characteristics of civilization. So Freud identifies developments in science and technology as obviously being a part of civilization. Another part is what he calls higher mental activities, things like philosophy, art, sciences, achievements in knowledge. Another characteristic is beauty, order, cleanliness. But importantly for Sigmund Freud, in order for civilization to achieve all of these things and to have these characteristics that we can all identify, it has to some extent, neuter the individuality of each individual person. Ultimately, the freedom and the power of the individual is replaced with the power of the community. Freud says, quote, "A good part of the struggle for humanity culminates in the task of finding an expedient balance, one that will bring happiness, between the demands of the individual and those of the masses under civilization. It is one of humanity's fateful problems, whether this balance can be achieved through a particular form of civilization or whether the conflict is irreconcilable." End quote. I think it might be useful here to think about the id, the ego, and the superego again. So these are the three psychoanalytic entities in your mind that are constantly either struggling with each other or negotiating with each other or mediating with each other. And the id is generally in charge of these unconscious, instinctual desires. The superego is your sense of morality and ethics. And the ego mediates between these two things, right? So Freud is saying in a very similar way, the individual person has these instinctual desires and they want their pleasure principles to be able to have freedom and find expression, but civilization has to tamp that down in order to create order and cleanliness and sort of the neat and tidy developments that civilization can achieve. They can't just have every person running around wild, satisfying their basic id instincts. So for Sigmund Freud, much of civilization is really all about the depriving of these instincts, repressing them, suppressing them, not allowing them to be satisfied. And Freud thinks that this is going to lead to a ton of problems. He calls it cultural renunciation, and he thinks it's the key to really all hostility and all civilizational discontent. Taboos and laws and customs, governments, economic systems, all in place to prop up the values of civilization. Again, technology, science, order, cleanliness, all that stuff we mentioned earlier. And civilization wants to restrict the autonomy, and in particular for Freud, the sexual autonomy of society. It's interesting, right, that Freud comes to this conclusion that the thing in the way of our happiness is civilization itself. And it starts to make sense that if you buy this, people often have this animosity towards culture or towards civilization. And whatever the trends or cultural flashpoints are at the moment, they seem to work people up, maybe more than they should. And it's here that we get to this idea of the paradox of civilization. And again, if you buy the idea from Freud that much of our suffering comes from civilization, the paradox is that anything we use to alleviate that suffering is itself going to be a product of the very same civilization. How do you use something that's making you unhappy to suddenly make you happy. Freud calls this the paradox of civilization, and it hints at where Freud is going with his thinking in this book, Civilization and Its Discontents. We've established that it seems like at least most of humanity is unhappy to some extent. Freud goes on to say that civilization is the obstacle in the way of this happiness. But the question still remains, how do we use civilization to our advantage, considering we're probably not getting out of it anytime soon? Other important questions still remain to be answered. If civilization is the enemy, then were the peoples of the past, who Freud might identify as primitive, were they happier than we are now? What about all the positives of science and technology that have certainly made the world better and happier for a lot of people? How does Freud explain that? And we got a little bit of Freud's development of civilization and how he thinks it developed to where it is now in this episode. And hopefully we understand why he thinks that civilization is the enemy. But why exactly is it that civilization makes us unhappy? And what are the specific things that it does in order to do that? And how do we deal with this paradox of civilization as mere humans? So in the next episode, we will get very deep on human nature, the mechanisms that civilization uses to deal with it, where pathologies and defense mechanisms come from in a psychoanalytic perspective, and the general story of civilization. So from Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. That's coming in the next episode. Thanks for making it this far. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.